joiners, we can just add them in. Thank you everyone for joining us for this month's Brown Bag Learning Series here through the Framingham Public Library. My name is Allison Beatty. I am the head of reference here at the library, and I'm very excited to introduce both Lynne Damianos and Brett Peruzzi on our Brown Bag Learning Series on your book publishing journey. So a little bit about both of them. Lynne has published more than 50 books in a variety of genres for other people, and she's published 4 of her own as well, and provides consulting and project management for authors, and all of that includes, coordination with the editor, designer, printer, Library of Congress, marketing, everything through her publishing company, which you can find online at damianospublishing.com. And Brett is a freelance writer and editor who has over 30 years of experience in his field. He provides a variety of service to authors, including developmental and copy editing, proofreading, marketing, publicity, and social media. So between the two of them, they really have everything covered. And you can contact him at peruzzi.communications.com. And before I turn it fully over to them, just letting you know, this meeting is being recorded. It will be available at a future date on the Framingham Library's YouTube channel. We'll send out an email or a social media blast when that is ready to go. And I will also be putting into the chat our evaluation form at the end of the session. So if you could just take, a minute or two as we're wrapping things up to fill that out for me, that would be lovely. And if you have any questions for either Brett or Lynne, feel free to shoot them in the chat. We'll do a little bit of a Q&A towards the end, and I'll just kind of make a note of the questions that get asked, so they can get answered. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Lynne and Brett.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having us, Allison, and it's wonderful to see everybody here today, some of whom I know. So from my perspective, there are 7 steps to creating a book. The first, of course, is writing your manuscript. And I'll go through the 7 of them, and then I'll just talk a little bit more about each one. So writing would be the first step, and then professional editing and proofing would be the second step. The design of the book, the cover, and the interior. Project management, coordinating all those pieces together. Editor, printer, getting things online if you want, the design, the whole ball of wax, project managing that. Printing, if you so choose to do that, and some people want to have their books printed, some want to have them only available online, and some authors would prefer a combination of those two things. And then if you do want to have the books published, how do they get listed online? And finally, one of the most important steps, which is marketing your book. Now, as far as the writing part goes, there's many different types of books, etc. And one of the things that I find to be the most helpful is to put everything in one place. I spoke to an author yesterday who told me she had her manuscript done, but actually she had written 150 poems that were in different places on her computer. I asked her to simply put them all in one folder and then send them along to me. And that seemed like a challenge. So one of the things that I like to tell people is to think about a little bit of a system so that even if things are in a variety of places or in separate documents, that they are together in one folder that you can easily access. And anyone that has done any kind of writing, when you're really close to your own project, you may think, well, I'm really great. I'm a writer. I don't need to have anybody else look at this to edit it or proof it. And I find that that is typically not correct, that when you're so close to something, you miss a lot of details, issues, inconsistencies, and things like that. So it is very important to have something professionally edited and proofread. And then finally, when we get into the design, you may have no idea what you would want your book to look like, or you may have some ideas. And so one thing to think about is to collect little notes or snapshots of things that you especially like about book covers or book interiors, or things that you don't like, so that when you are working with a designer, or perhaps are putting a book together yourself, you have some basis on which to start with. And for example, our designer would ask you, what colors do you like? Are there certain features that you want to promote? on the book. Perhaps there are some photographs or some illustrations that you're very fond of that you would like to include, that type of thing. But it would help make the process go more smoothly if you have some of those things that you like in a place that you can share with a designer. One of my jobs as a publisher is to coordinate things. So do the intake with an author, get all the information, what they're looking to do. Is there a deadline for when they want to have their book project completed? So for example, some people like to have a book completed before a holiday, or perhaps they're speaking at an event and they like to be able to hand books out or sell books at that event. So it's good to know deadlines. So the publisher, writer, designer, editor can work backwards and figure out deadlines that would be needed as they progressed along. And that's really all part of project management, is coordinating all those things. If you don't feel the need to have your book available online, it could simply be printed, and that can keep costs down, but it doesn't keep your book, doesn't get your book out there as widely as it would be if it was available online through Amazon and other sources. So I think it's a great idea to do that. And typically in today's world, the beauty of having your book available online is that you don't need to print hundreds or thousands of copies of it. It can be printed on demand, POD, print on demand, so that when someone goes to a distributor's website or Amazon, they can simply order a book. It's printed one by one and fulfilled by the distributor or Amazon. And so the author doesn't have to deal with any of those costs. Later, they would end up getting a royalty for books sold online. So that can be a really nice thing to do. And there's typically no added direct cost to listing your book online. You just need to have someone help you do that. And then finally, marketing your book. And that can mean a lot of different things. But typically, I recommend that you as an author do your own research and also help do things with social media to help spread the word about your book. It's also a good idea to talk to a marketing specialist such as Brett, and he can talk a little bit more about that as well. But if you take ownership of the whole project and you are involved in the marketing, in the promotion of your book, you're going to find that you're going to be a lot more successful. So that's kind of an overview of the process. And now I'm going to turn it over to Brett to talk about editing and where you would go once you have your manuscript together in some kind of fashion.
Thanks, Lynn. So I'm going to talk about various phases and types of editing and proofreading. First of all, we want to talk about developmental, or also known as substantive editing. That's also known sometimes as structural or content editing. And that's really a high-level edit. That's to make sure that your organization, your structure, your content, language, style, presentation, a whole host of factors are suitable for who you're writing for and what you're writing about. It's the most difficult and time-consuming type of editing. So typically when you're hiring somebody to do it, it's the most expensive. And depending upon the length of your book, the complexity, the number of words versus illustrations, estimates are all over the map on how much time that would take. If you were dealing with, let's say, a novel, and I'm editing a novel right now, so a fiction manuscript, it's going to cover things like the theme, plot, characters, dialogue, pacing, tension within the story, and the setting. For nonfiction, and I've edited quite a few nonfiction books, a developmental editor is going to help you with some of those more prosaic things like organization, flow, presentation, clarity, flow, and tone. Oftentimes, an editor for books is a subject matter expert in certain genres. So for instance, I've edited several poetry books, and I'm a poet myself. So I think that brings more import to my edits, because I'm not just looking at it as an English teacher with a red pen, but somebody who does creative writing myself and has written and published poetry widely. So I have a better sense of what a poet is trying to achieve versus a cookbook writer, let's say. Again, developmental editing can involve significant rewriting or suggestions for organizing the manuscript and maybe deleting some parts. A good editor will always bring shape, focus, and economy to a manuscript. And there's a famous tale in the publishing industry, Maxwell Perkins of Scribner's. He was the editor for F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, as well as Thomas Wolfe, who wrote Look Homeward Angel, as well as some other famous novels in the first couple of decades of the 20th century. And Thomas Wolfe was prolific, I would say, to a fault. He handed in a manuscript for Look Homeward Angel that was almost 650 pages long. And Max Perkins said, Tom, this is a great book. You're a genius, but I can't sell a 650-page novel in the marketplace today. And he ended up really kind of being the sculptor of the novel, and he cut 240 pages or so. And he didn't lop it off the end. I mean, he surgically, edited it and found what he thought were redundant passages or things that didn't advance the plot. And he reshaped it into one of the great American novels. Now, was it a genius work at 640 pages? Perhaps, but it was more sprawling, and it probably wouldn't have had the success that it did. So that's a rather dramatic example of the impact an editor can have on, say, a fiction manuscript. But most of it is more of the more everyday stuff to bring shape, clarity, and focus to a manuscript. The next phase of editing is copy editing. Okay, so that's getting more into the details. That's really to make sure that your manuscript is accurate, it has clarity and consistency. And when I say consistency, for example, I use the Chicago Manual of Style, which is pretty much the standard reference work for book publishing. Do you capitalize this? Do you, spell out the abbreviation to this? Does this get abbreviated? I mean, there is 1,000,001 rules in Chicago. And it's typical when I read an author's manuscript that there are a lot of wild inconsistencies. I mean, we're all fallible as writers, but oftentimes people are writing a book manuscript over a long period of time. So they may have said AM, just AM, one day, and then the next day they're less tired or more tired, then they put A period, M period. So the job of an editor like me is to go in and make sure all those things are consistent, because what you don't want to do is have things like that in print with the finished product, because it really distracts from the objective of the book. And that's, either to educate or entertain or otherwise enlighten your audience. You don't want them scratching their head every other page and saying, why does that look like this here and look like that there? Is there a reason for that? No, probably not. Again, copy editing is all about finding the errors in grammar, punctuation, spelling, formatting, consistency. And as I said, things like style of capitalization, numerals. I mean, I just finished editing a book. I can't tell you how many numbers there were in that book. It was a history book. And there was various ordinal numbers, for the names of military regiments, let's say. There was dates for battles. And I made sure that they were all consistent, again, to make it easier for the audience to comprehend the material and to have faith in the veracity of that material, since it was a nonfiction book. The final phase is proofreading. And proofreading is typically not done until the book is designed. That's really the final quality check, to make sure that what you gave to the designer is what you're going to have in the end result of the published book. That's making sure that anything that you corrected in previous drafts made it into that final copy, that there's no anomalies that were introduced through the design process. And by the way, that goes for ebooks as well as printed books. So those are the three stages. As I said, first you have developmental editing or content editing, copy editing, and the final stage of quality to make sure that you have as flawless a manuscript as possible. And I always say as possible because virtually every commercial book that I read from the big publishers in New York, I usually find an error or two. Nobody's infallible, but we try to do the best we can. And it's kind of a sick hobby of mine, I guess, that because I am an editor, whenever I read a book, not only do I find errors that other people might not find, but I see inconsistencies. It's a terrible burden to have as a reader sometimes. So I'll turn it back to Lynne.
Okay. The next phase would be, the next thing to think about would be the design of the book. And one thing that's really important and part of what I do as a publisher is I get to know the author and what their goals are. So if there's a book that's going to be mostly text on the inside, most likely that book could be printed as a monochrome book, meaning black and white on the inside. But if there are going to be photographs, we want to figure out, do those photographs, do we want to have them in color or black and white? And that's a really important question, because when a book is put together, the more color that you have inside the book, it does drive the cost up. And typically a book that's color on the inside is about 5 times more expensive to produce on the printing press as a book that's all black and white inside. Now, you may have a variety of illustrations, some in color and some in black and white. So if the color can be condensed into several areas, we can insert color pages within the monochrome book here and there and keep the cost down that way. And that's, you may see some books that you buy where the color is all together. And the reason for that is to save money on the printing. So it's really important for you to think about the interior of the book as far as color versus black and white. There are also different printing processes to keep the color costs down, but that's an important thing to think about. A lot of authors may say, well, I'd like to have a color image at the chapter header for each chapter, so they would be sprinkled throughout the book. Well, we can certainly do that, but that means that the entire book would be considered color on the interior. So that's something to think about right off the bat and to work that out in the beginning so that we can give the most cost-effective way to produce the book. I'm going to show you some examples in a minute, some book covers, just as some food for thought. But it's also a really great idea to do your market research and find out what other books are out there that may be similar to what you're proposing to write or produce. And also to think about a working title for your book. And that may change as you go through the process of having the book designed and produced, but you want to see, are there other books out there with the same or a similar title? And if there are, and that title is really important to you, you may want to think about having a subtitle that would differentiate your book from the others. But it's amazing when I do a search, for example, just on Amazon, how many books have similar titles. And you really want to try to avoid that if you can. Also, it's a really good idea if you're going to have, for example, a book of poetry, to think about grouping your poems in order that makes sense, or by subject matter, and you could have different sections within your book, etc. If you need a table of contents, it may be helpful to think about putting that together and how things fall from beginning to end. Okay, let me just share my screen and I'll show you a couple of book covers and some things to think about. Okay, can everybody see that? Okay, so this is a book where the author had created a series of illustrations illustrating the letters of the Jewish alphabet. And inside the book, all of the illustrations were in black and white. And so she had not created an illustration in color, but it was our suggestion to actually do so and have that on the cover of the book. And this is an example of integrating the illustrations with type and how we can work the two of them together to give something that's complementary and inviting to the reader. And then you'll notice on the back of the book that this author had some testimonials that she was able to obtain that we could include on the back of the book that gives some credibility to the book, etc. Now, Sharon Salinger, you can see her picture in the lower left, comes from a long line of very famous authors. And she actually had 2 books that were produced by a big publishing house. And typically with those big publishing houses, you need to have a literary agent, and they're basically your marketing guru. Someone's going to help you out to get your book out there, get a lot of copies sold. She was very disappointed. She felt that she was not given a lot of time, that she was just one of many other clients, etc. And that's why she chose to go to a hybrid publisher like I am, to give her more attention and to really provide what she was looking for. It surprised me. I was very shocked. that she had that experience. Here's another example. This is, of course, again, the front and the back cover of a book with the spine in the middle. And this was produced by the Dedham Historical Society. And it was basically about three brothers who had written letters home to their mother during the Civil War. And so one of the things that we thought was interesting was, since the interior of the book was going to be typeset in a computer, the authors really felt it was nice to have some of the original handwriting show within the book. So as you can see, we use some of that on the cover itself, along with photographs of the three brothers. And then on the back side of the book, on the left-hand side, there are some artifacts relating to the three brothers in the war itself. But incorporating some of the original letters, it was a way of keeping alive the actual letters, even though the interior was going to be typeset in a new, more contemporary, more easily readable font. And then finally, my last two slides, this was a proposed cover by a local Natick artist and children's book author. And this was her concept for what her cover would look like. And after speaking to our designer, et cetera, we came up with this. This is, again, is the front and the back cover. But we felt that having fewer illustrations and something that was more vibrant would help attract people to the book. And these are both illustrations that the author created, and they also appear inside the book itself. So by using strong complementary colors, some fonts that kind of play to the idea of a children's book, et cetera, felt like it was a much more powerful statement than the proposed, which seemed to kind of be milky, not as vibrant, even though the actual illustrations were very, very strong, as you can see here. So one of the most important things is to really think about things that you are attracted to for illustrations, for your book cover, or little things that might be included on the inside that could be used at the beginning of chapters or on the running footers or at the top of each page, that might tie in some of the concepts that your book is trying to call out to the reader with. So the design can be really an interesting and fun process. And I would say start a scrapbook or start a folder on your computer and think about things that you like that can be perhaps brought into use for your cover or inside illustrations. In addition, I typically think it's a good idea to have a checklist of about book structure and design, and it's something that I can email to you if you're interested in starting to work on your own book, but it's something that I already have in place that could help you. And I think that is it for the book design process. And I'm going to turn it back over to Brett for the marketing of your book.
Thank you again, Lynn. So let's talk about marketing your proposed book. The good news in the digital age and with other advanced computer technologies is that anybody can literally be an author. The bad news is the internet and the real world is littered with thousands of books that may have good content, but never reach a wide audience because of a failure of marketing. You know, our books are our babies to some extent, and everybody thinks their babies are beautiful. But if the rest of the world doesn't know about that book, no matter how beautiful it is, you're not going to sell a lot of them. So what I do when I work with clients on book marketing, the first thing that I do, you know, after some preliminary conversations to get a better understanding of what the book's about, if I was not the editor of it, let's say, is I create a book marketing plan. And, you know, like a marketing plan for anything else, you're looking at your book as a product. Again, it is our baby and we're attached to it, you know, emotionally, but you really need to look at it from a business perspective. And a book marketing plan is going to cover such things as giving really a high-level executive summary of the book, who the target audience is, the competition, some competitive analysis, and Lynn mentioned, you know, looking on Amazon for books with similar titles or topics. Then your marketing objectives, your strategy, how you're actually going to carry out those objectives, the tactics, the specific things that you will do to carry out those objectives, and then determining what your marketing budget is. And, a marketing budget can be very small. It can really just be, creating the marketing plan and maybe doing a few other small things, or you can go big and you can buy ads and, all sorts of things. A very, very important part of book marketing in today's world, and this goes for people that are with the big New York publishers and everybody on down, regional or niche or specialty publishers, hybrid publishers like Damianos and others in that space, is the author platform. Now, what do I mean by author platform? That's having a website, a blog, social media accounts, an email list, something that lists your expertise in your field. If you're doing a nonfiction book, that depends upon your knowledge of a topic, previous books you've written, or magazine articles, other digital media writings that you've done, and do you have an existing readership? And I'll be the first one to tell you, I have friends that are contracted to major publishers, and major publishers want their authors to have an author platform as well. Believe it or not, even some of the majors don't do all the marketing for you. They'll do a certain amount, but as Lynne talked about with one of our clients, Sharon Singer Salinger, she had been with a major New York publisher that she felt gave her somewhat short shrift. So you can't rely upon even a major publisher to do it all. You've got to take the bull by the horns and do some of that work yourself. And I believe it brings a lot of credibility and visibility to an author, because readers read books, but they also like to connect with authors. And I follow some of my favorite authors on social media, and it's a really cool experience that I can comment on their posts, and sometimes they'll reply back to me. I mean, we just didn't have that option back in the pre-digital days. And people that engage with you on social media or other digital platforms are people that you're building into your fan base. And I can't tell you how many people I know that have sold books through their online activity. If you're really lucky, with the dwindling amount of print newspapers, you get a reporter or a style editor to write an article about you and your book. But you'll probably reach just as many, if not more, people posting on Facebook or Instagram. That's just the way it is now. I mean, print is a diminishing world in the world of media. Just think about how many newspapers there were 20 years ago that even covered the Metro West community compared to today. So there's a variety of ways you can get publicity. In traditional media, we use what's called a media kit, which consists of a news release and a backgrounder type of article or document that explains who you are and why your book's important, gives a summary of the book, has your author photo, your bio, your contact info, probably a screenshot of the book cover, just like Lynne showed a few minutes ago. Some people will do some sample Q&As, questions and answers with the author. Reporters love that because that's kind of doing some of their work for them, right? At least it's a teaser for the kind of questions that maybe they should ask you. And they have what's called a sell sheet, which kind of lists all the particulars of the book, price, where it's available, and so forth. And another nice teaser item that you can put into a media kit is a book excerpt. Nothing like a sample chapter, especially if it ends with a cliffhanger to draw people in and want them to find out how things turned out in that story, right? So those are some of the tools you can use to get publicity. Where are you going to do that? Well, the web is king these days. Websites, blogs, podcasts, again, print newspapers, especially local, because local newspapers like to cover local authors. It's a lot harder to get in the Boston Globe than it probably is the Metro West Daily News, right? Magazines, and if you're really lucky and skilled at marketing, or you hire somebody that is, if you can get onto TV or radio, that's a lot harder. I have a friend that does PR who worked in the broadcast industry for a long time. He has a lot of connections, but the gold standard would be something like showing up on Oprah, right? I mean, people have gone from obscurity to being New York Times bestsellers with one appearance on that show, but they are somewhat the rarities in the publishing world today. And for everybody that's on Oprah, there's thousands of other authors who are probably just as skilled at writing, but just don't have the exposure. Social media, I mentioned that briefly before, but as most of us that have been conscious for the past 20 years know, it has exploded. My millennial daughter got me onto it probably 12 years ago. The kids have long ago abandoned Facebook, and they think it's a place for grandpa and grandma now. They've kind of decamped for Instagram, but Facebook is still a very, very strong marketing channel to appeal to a lot of age groups. But again, if you're going for the younger crowd, Instagram is king right now. Twitter, not so much. Twitter is somewhat evolved into kind of like a political blood sport place and place for breaking news, but you can put it into your social media mix if you want. If you're doing anything business related or tech related, LinkedIn, I mean, that is the place where people get jobs and business information. And if your book is in any of those spheres, LinkedIn is a good place to be. In fact, I have a family member now that just published with a UK publisher, and it's about the financial markets, and he is doing a lot of postings on LinkedIn and getting a lot of attention. Another technique you can use, which is time honored, although it's been a struggle during the pandemic, is speaking engagements and readings. Most of them have been virtual, as you can imagine, for the past year and a half, but they are starting to come back in at least a limited fashion in person. And the beauty of doing in-person readings, and again, I have friends with major publishers that do them as well as people who have published their own books, is that you have copies of your book with you and you sell them on premise. Now, with an online reading, you can provide a link to your Amazon site or whatever other distributor you're using, and you'll get some degree of click-through if people like your book. But just think about it. If you've ever been to a reading, and I've been to many, many readings, when you just heard the author talk for half an hour and you're excited about the book and you're in a room full of people who are excited about the book, and then that author sits down behind a table with a Sharpie ready to inscribe those books, boy, does that make people hit the buy button, because it's right there, it's immediate, it can be somewhat of an impulse purchase, but you just don't have the same impetus to buy when you see a link show up on a screen. I mean, there's something tactile about being with people and being able to have them sign it and customize it for you, an inscription. So I'm talking mostly about printed books, but there is certainly a market for ebooks as well. I don't know what the statistics are. I mean, we were on the rise for a number of years with people reading on Kindles and other devices. That seems to have somewhat peaked, and I don't know if that's a temporary trend, because printing is expensive. You can buy an ebook for a lot cheaper on any of the distribution platforms. Audiobooks are another, option some people pursue as well. And it seems like I know more and more people who listen to books rather than actually read them. So there is options that there weren't as prevalent before. I mean, everybody remembers books on tape if you're of a certain age, and it's a lot easier to stream it on your smartphone now. But I personally am a fan of the tactile experience of actually holding a book. And after I'm on my laptop all day, squinting at other people's manuscripts and other writing and editing work that I do, last thing I'm going to pick up is another device. I want the paper. It's soothing to my eyes and gives them a break. Let's see, what else? Oh, I was talking about speaking engagements. So where do you do them? Well, one of the primary places that you find readers is where we are, at least virtually speaking, the Framingham Public Library. Libraries love to sponsor readings by local authors, as do local bookstores. Now, they're becoming somewhat of a dinosaur. There aren't a lot of local bookstores now. I mean, I think in the 20 plus years I lived in Framingham, we've lost virtually all of them. Do we have any left at this point? But there was probably close to half a dozen, if not in Framingham, but in Natick and Marlborough. And that's harder. There's still a few. Sometimes you need to travel a bit further afield. I have a friend that has done several readings at Wellesley Booksmith. It's Brookline Booksmith, and there's the Wellesley Bookshop, but they're still out there, and there are still good venues. And there's there's plenty of other opportunities for author speaking engagements. Do you belong to a spiritual organization that invites guest speakers? That might be an option. For instance, with Sharon Singer Salinger, she did something on the Hebrew alphabet, and I did marketing for her. One of the first things we did was contact temples. She's done speaking engagements at several temples because it's obviously of interest to the audience. So if you put on your thinking cap and you collaborate with somebody that knows perhaps more than you about marketing, you can probably generate a list of a lot of likely suspects or places that you can do a reading and probably sell some books as well. Final thing I'll talk about in marketing is getting reviews. How do you get reviews? No, most books do not end up in the New York Times book review. Again, that is kind of the top of the market. It's very competitive to get in there. It's, if not mostly, it might be almost all agented books from major publishers that typically get featured. It's kind of like the slotting in supermarkets, right? People that are selling salsa, pay to get that eye-level shelf. And the lesser brands are either out of your reach or they're way down below that you have to squat down for. And books are no different. But you, as a perhaps independent author, can fight the powers that be to some extent and get some reviews. How do you get them? You can do book giveaways and free downloads online for at least the tacit idea that somebody will give you a review. Amazon doesn't allow you to give away books quid pro quo, saying that you have to review it if I'm going to give you a copy, but most people will at least write a few lines because they feel some degree of gratitude for getting a freebie. In addition to Amazon, which everybody knows is the, I won't even say 800-pound, it's the 900-pound gorilla in the online publishing world. There's a great site called goodreads.com that some of you bibliophiles may be familiar with. And that is probably second to Amazon in terms of reviews, because it allows people to create independent accounts, create reading lists of books that they're interested in, that they've read, and then post reviews. And I know for a fact that a lot of authors use it heavily, and a lot of readers rely upon it sometimes to get the next books they want to read. And then finally, and probably the least, or the last thing on your list, I would say, in terms of priority, there are paid reviews. If you've ever seen, a book that says, 3 stars from Kirkus Reviews, Kirkus Reviews are paid. And my friends that are with major publishers still have Kirkus Reviews, even though they're with a big New York publisher, because they know the brand recognition and the value of a Kirkus review. Now, it varies, what the cost is, but some people think it's worth it, and they don't just, pander and write entirely positive reviews. I've seen them put some critiques in there as well, which I think, number one, keeps them honest and continues their credibility. And it's a credit that you can use because it is a well-known brand in the publishing and reading world. So that's kind of like my my speed date for you with book marketing. We'll have questions at the end. You can ask them, and you can put them in the chat as well, but I'll turn it back to Lynne again.
So one of the things that I really want to encourage you to think about is don't be afraid to toot your own horn. A lot of authors are shy, but the more you can do that, the better. One of our recent authors, actually Janice Ledke, who did the children's book that I showed the cover of, I encouraged her to go to local farmers markets, as Brett did as well. And she was very shy about that. And so I saw her recently at one, and she said, the first one was really tough and it got easier. I'm meeting lots of people and I'm selling more books. And so that was a good thing. Also on my website, damianospublishing.com, which is in the chat, I do have a resource page that lists a lot of different resources. And one of them is the design and production checklist, which you can download as a PDF. And it gives you some things to think about, such as, what size should my book be? And that's a whole nother topic we could go on about. But there's a lot of good resources there. And if you are interested in moving forward, feel free to reach out to me, and I'd be happy to give you a 1-hour consult at no charge and help you along your way. So I think if we have questions, we certainly have some time for your questions.
Yeah, I saw one in the chat. Please write a list of independent reviewers here. That's probably easier said than done. I mean, I would point you to sites like Amazon and Goodreads, and you can probably pretty quickly discern who some of the top reviewers are by the number of reviews they've posted. I don't have a list or maintain a list, and it changes fairly frequently. And you have to realize too that many reviewers are genre specific. So there's people that read a lot of science fiction or fantasy. There's people that, you know, specialize in military history. So anything I could put in the chat probably won't apply to 90% of you, so I won't even attempt it.
Howard.
Thank you. It's been a wonderful presentation, and you've both made clear what it is that you do. The only thing missing is some sense of the fees that are attached to what you do. I know each of us here probably has a different book in mind, but so it may be difficult to do, but if you could give us some sense of what would it cost?
Sure.
You,
I can speak to that. So a lot of that's going to depend on how far along you are with your book. So some authors may already have, maybe they've already provided the interior in PDF format and they just need a cover design. Some may have a lot of ideas for their cover, and some may come with really not much finished except for the manuscript that needs to be edited. So it's going to depend on all of that. But typically for design work, we have an hourly charge, and also and Brett can talk more about this, he has an hourly charge for his editing and proofing. For my role as a publisher, and I would include things like registering your book with the Library of Congress, getting your ISBN number, helping you figure out the list price for your book, making it available on Amazon and our distributor, doing my coordination with Brett, the designer, the printer, etc. I typically charge a flat fee, and depending on how much handholding you need, that fee would range probably from $750 to $900. So that would be my portion. And then for design fee, I would say it could be as little as 4 hours up to maybe 20 hours. And typically the design fee is about $100 per hour. So it can be little depending on, we have one author who's maybe done 6 books with us. And basically we just design the cover, and the interior he already has laid out in PDF. So that's very short amount of time.
Well,
And Brett,
and I'll chime in that prior to fully engaging on the project, we could provide an estimate once we do a preliminary evaluation of the manuscripts. So that's why there's a wide variety of quotes, and I don't even know to quote an average makes any sense because every book is unique. But I would say one of the ground rules is the more work you bring up front, as Lynn, I think, made clear, so you bring us as close to a finished product as possible, the lower your costs are going to become. And I think, Lynn, you had that famous story of the gentleman that had just a bunch of boxes with piles of papers in them, and he said, "Make my book."
literally.
I would have had a very high estimate for that project. That was before my time with Lynne.
Well, and when people do come to us and they don't have a clear idea of what they wanted to do, for example, this gentleman was a war correspondent and he covered 10 wars, and he had his reporter's notebooks and photographs just thrown in these boxes. And so he wasn't sure how to organize his book. Does he do it by the war, by the year, by the country, so he had a lot of ideas. And so usually what we would do is provide an initial consult and to kind of give him some focus, and then he might go and do his thing and then come back a little bit later with things a little bit more organized. So, we do things like that as well. So, there's a lot of give and take.
In terms of next steps, I don't really understand the relationship between Lynn and Brett. So should we contact Lynn, contact Brett? How does this go for the next step?
That's a great question, Howard. Thank you. So basically, Brett has his own company, and the designer that we work with, Lisa Thompson, has her own company as well. And basically, I kind of look at it as an umbrella. So typically, people would come to me. I would look at what they have. I would provide the manuscript to both Brett and to the designer for estimates and ideas, and they get back to you. So I kind of do the coordination, and that usually works pretty smoothly that way.
There was another question in the chat, and this was regarding how do I, quote, sell my book manuscript to a publisher? As with many questions like that, it depends. If you're going after what I would call the traditional publisher, the large publisher, it's virtually impossible to approach some of the large publishers without having an agent. If you're dealing with a smaller, either niche or regional publisher or specialty publisher, sometimes you can get it in unagented. And you can with some fairly large publishers, but it's a lot harder. They have what they call the slush pile. Back in the day when people were sending in printed manuscripts versus emailing them digital manuscripts. And essentially, if they haven't solicited a manuscript, through an agent or some other channel, they have a big pile of the ones that just kind of get thrown over the transom. And typically they'll put a low-level assistant editor or reader on that to see if there's anything worthwhile in that. So you're up against the odds that way. If you're dealing with a hybrid publisher like Damianos, our goal is to give a publishing voice to everybody, with the assurances that the end product will be professionally edited and designed, and the whole package will come together seamlessly. So it's a book that you feel proud of, having in your name, and that we feel proud of having been associated with. And the problem is, in the old days of traditional publishing, they only published a fraction probably of the worthwhile books. Now, there's plenty of voices out there that should be heard, and there's plenty of reasons people publish books. We've published books that people, let's say, in a certain business niche want, as Lynn, I think, referred to, to use as a giveaway to promote their consulting services or other expertise in a field. There's people that just want to do a memoir or a biography of their life or their family as a keepsake for their family, as a legacy, something that will outlive them. We've done things that people have published for friends that were deceased that they have given away at memorial services that, is kind of a really lyrical description of some of the high points of their lives. There's for every book, there's a reason for publishing it. But with today's technology and hybrid publishers, as well as some people who go it alone and do completely independent self-publishing, there's no limit into what you can do, but you don't have the gatekeepers of yore that said that, to publish a book, you need to meet the following criteria, because when you publish with a traditional publisher, their bottom line is, are we going to make money? And typically it's not a little amount of money. They want to make big money. So they're ferreting out, the 1% or 2% of book manuscripts out there that they think are going to be big sellers because they're in business to make money. That's not the case with academic presses, small niche presses, and certainly not the case with hybrid publishing, where you are working with the publisher at your cost to bring out your book. So kind of a long-winded answer, but I don't mean to discourage anybody, but that's the reality.
I want to add to that, which is, a traditional publisher typically would give an advance to an author that they want to work with, et cetera. And the author has really no cost involved except for their time. And the way a hybrid publisher such as myself would work is that you're actually paying to have the work published. However, some people may say, well, I can't afford this or whatever. And so you can get sponsors. Some of our authors look to organizations or private companies to sponsor their books, and they may get a little mention in the acknowledgement page in the beginning of the book to thank that firm. And so it is possible that there's an organization that might be close to the subject matter or close to you that is willing to do that for you. So that's another idea. As far as getting into bookstores, one of the things that I do as a publisher as a baseline is I send out a press release to a lot of my usual places, and then Brett would take it from there if you want to pursue with more advanced marketing. And many times from the press release that I send out, bookstores will be very interested, but typically the way it works is the author would approach local bookstores like the Wellesley bookstore, the one in Brookline, or wherever you're located, and ask them if they would be interested in carrying the book. And it's really, it really depends on the book, the author, and the bookstore. We used to do a lot of that in the past. Barnes & Noble would have book signing events for our authors and would carry the books for 2 months. And if the book sold, then they would continue to carry them on their shelves. They're not willing to do that anymore. It's become much tighter, but there still are some local bookstores that are interested. And I find it best if the author makes the pitch to that store and they have a local connection there. Unfortunately, but it seems
That's
like
a good point, Lynn. And the clients that I've worked with in trying to get into local bookstores, it's on consignment. So they don't want to take on the risk of an unknown quantity. So you say, okay, I'll give you 6 books to have in stock. And if you sell them, I get some, you get some. There's some sort of a quid pro quo there because again, they're in the business to make money. In terms of getting into larger bookstores, that's a much higher hurdle to jump.
The other interesting thing is that your books can be sold in places other than bookstores. And one of the books that I published of my own was sold by a local hardware store, which seems rather bizarre because the book was about the history of the Saxonville mills. But the hardware store is literally across the street from the mills. And a lot of people knew about that they had family members that worked in the mill, et cetera, et cetera. And they put copies of this book, and the books sold for, they were not cheap. They were color books, and they put them on the counter, and we sold hundreds and hundreds of books through the hardware store. So if you're writing a children's book, maybe it could be sold in a children's clothing store, gift shops. I mean, there's other places that are not necessarily a bookstore that might be interested in carrying your book. So
that's a good point. And one other example I'll give, I have a friend that wrote a historical nonfiction book, and he sold a lot of his in the context of doing presentations to historical societies all over Massachusetts. And if you look at the Framingham History Center gift shop, and full disclosure, I'm on the board there. I've been involved as a volunteer. They have a lot of books by local authors. And if you're writing about Framingham history, you want to be in the Framingham History Center, gift store, because that's where people that are interested in that are going to go. And that ties back to Lynn saying, inexplicably, how did she sell a book about Saxonville mills in a hardware store? Well, because it was across the street from the mills. It probably wouldn't have sold much, in a Natick hardware store or a Westboro hardware store. But think about proximity to your subject and affinity for your subject. And there is a whole host of other places besides traditional bookstores, which is, as I said earlier, is a paucity of these days. You just have to be a little bit more creative sometimes.
It's a good idea to think about all of your affiliations, your alma mater, any organizations you're in, and just start creating lists, because those are people that you're going to want to reach out to and let them know about your book, or it's something that can be included in, say, the press release that I would send out. You never know. And all those connections have a lot of power, and they can generate additional connections for you too. Any other questions? I think during the pandemic, a lot of people started writing more so than they did before. Howard, you're muted.
I have I just have a question because most of, in the past, when I've published books, I've ended up selling them myself at readings that I did. And so just whatever the price is set as a book, is there a discount for the author to get quantities of books?
Yes. Yes. In my program anyway, there's an author's price. So say your book's going to sell for $20 and say it's a black and white book, 6x9, I don't know how many pages, but say it costs you $5 to have it printed. So if you were selling it yourself, you'd be making $15 per book. If it was sold online, you would make less than that, but you wouldn't be paying to have it printed. It would just be sold by whoever's going to buy it, sold to whoever's going to buy it for $20, and you would get a royalty of some amount. It would not be as much as the $15 in that example, but you, again, wouldn't have to have it printed and have a stockpile of books. But yes, the authors would always get a discount. And if you purchase typically 100 books or more, there's a higher savings. 300 and more, there's a higher savings as well, if you order quantity at one time. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
All right, if no one has any more questions, I want to thank everyone for joining us, and thank you again to Brett and Lynn. This was a fabulous presentation. I have put the link to the evaluation form in the chat. If everyone could just take a minute as we're wrapping up, that would be great. And as I said before, this will be available on the Framingham Library's YouTube page and possibly Facebook. I am not entirely sure. I don't handle that. I just host and I give it to someone and they take care of it. But it will be up, and I will let you know once it has been posted. I'm gonna go ahead and stop the recording.